A quiet afternoon in the park. The air was crisp, filled with the laughter of children and the scent of freshly mown grass. Harmony Park buzzed with life on that beautiful Saturday afternoon. The playground was alive with children climbing and sliding, their parents keeping a watchful eye nearby. Couples strolled hand in hand, while joggers maintained a steady rhythm on the winding trails. Under the sprawling shade of a massive oak tree, families enjoyed picnics, the occasional rustle of snack bags mixing with the gentle hum of conversation. On a wooden bench near the center of the park sat Malcolm Hayes. Dressed simply in a gray hoodie and jeans, he exuded an air of quiet contemplation. A well-worn paperback rested in his hands, its pages weathered by years of love. Beside him, a leather badge holder clipped to his pocket glinted briefly in the sunlight. Malcolm's demeanor was calm and relaxed, his focus firmly on the book. A stainless steel travel mug sat next to him, steam curling lazily from its lid. Across the park, Margaret Bennett observed the scene with sharp eyes. In her late 30s, Margaret prided herself on her vigilance. She was a staunch believer in the safety of her community and had a habit of noting anything that seemed out of place. Her golden retriever, Bailey, strained at the leash, eager to explore, but Margaret's attention was fixed on Malcolm. Margaret's brow furrowed as she watched him. Alone. No kids, no family. He was just sitting there. Why is he just sitting there? She thought to herself, an unease growing in the pit of her stomach. Bailey barked softly, pulling Margaret's focus momentarily, but she tightened her grip on the leash and scanned the park once more. The vibrant activity continued uninterrupted, but her eyes kept returning to Malcolm. Each time she glanced at him, her suspicion deepened. "This doesn't feel right," Margaret muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with irritation. "Who just sits at a park like that, not interacting with anyone?" She pulled Bailey closer, her grip on the leash tightening as she made a decision. Margaret's steps were deliberate as she approached Malcolm. Her golden retriever walked alongside her, its tail wagging innocently. Malcolm looked up briefly, his expression neutral but polite, before returning to his book. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice firm. Malcolm glanced up again, closing the book slightly to give her his full attention. "Yes," he replied, his tone calm. Margaret crossed her arms. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "You've been sitting here for hours. People are starting to feel uncomfortable." Malcolm's brow arched slightly, but his demeanor remained steady. "I didn't realize sitting on a public bench was a problem," he said evenly. "I'm just reading." "Reading?" Margaret scoffed. "Don't play dumb with me. You're just sitting here alone, watching everyone. It's suspicious." Malcolm sighed softly, leaning back against the bench. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just enjoying the day." "That's what they all say," Margaret retorted, her voice rising slightly. "This park is for families and residents, not for loitering." The exchange began to draw the attention of nearby parkgoers. A jogger slowed to a walk, his curious gaze flicking between Margaret and Malcolm. A couple sitting on a nearby bench exchanged glances, the woman subtly reaching for her phone to record the unfolding interaction. Malcolm's deep voice carried easily across the growing circle of onlookers. "I live 5 minutes from here," he said. "Is there something specific you think I've done wrong?" Margaret's face hardened. "You've done plenty wrong by sitting here and making everyone uncomfortable," she snapped. Her dog barked once, as if echoing her indignation. Malcolm rubbed his temples briefly before meeting her gaze again. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "if you feel unsafe, that's something you should reflect on, not project onto me." Margaret's eyes widened, her indignation flaring into anger. "Reflect on it," she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "I see a man who's out of place, and when someone looks out of place, that's a problem." The murmurs of the growing crowd grew louder. A group of teens paused their game of frisbee to watch. One of them, a boy in a red hoodie, nudged his friend. "She's freaking out over nothing," he muttered, pulling out his phone. This is going to go viral for sure. Margaret seemed oblivious to the attention. She pulled her phone from her pocket and waved it dramatically. "Let's just see what the police think about you hanging around here," she said. Malcolm's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of weariness crossing his face. "If you feel the need to call them," he said, his tone steady, "go ahead. I'm not going anywhere." Margaret dialed 911, her voice loud and deliberate, as she reported a suspicious man in the park. The crowd's murmurs turned to whispers of disbelief. The jogger shook his head, muttering under his breath. The woman recording whispered to her partner, "She's really doing this." Malcolm leaned back, his hands folded in his lap. His calm demeanor remained, but his eyes reflected the weariness of a man who had experienced this too many times before. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. Around them, the park fell into a tense silence, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. As the police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing, Margaret's expression shifted to one of triumph. She turned to Malcolm with a smug smile. "Let's see how calm you are now," she said. Malcolm's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "I hope you'll be able to say the same," he replied. Part 2. The Arrival of Truth. The police cruiser came to a halt at the park's entrance, its flashing lights cutting through the tranquil atmosphere. The sound of the engine fading was the only indication of the tension building among the onlookers. Two officers stepped out. Officer Jenkins, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and Officer Ramirez, younger and observant, her eyes scanning the scene as she adjusted her duty belt. Margaret immediately hurried toward them, her golden retriever barking in excitement at the commotion. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice laced with urgency. She pointed dramatically toward Malcolm, who still sat calmly on the bench, his book now closed and resting on his lap. "That man has been sitting here for hours, watching the playground, and making everyone uncomfortable. He refused to leave when I asked him to." Officer Jenkins' brow furrowed as he looked in Malcolm's direction. "Has he done anything threatening or illegal?" he asked, his tone measured. Margaret hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Well, no," she admitted, "but he's been sitting there alone, staring at everyone. It's suspicious." Ramirez's eyebrow arched slightly, and she exchanged a glance with Jenkins. "Sitting on a park bench isn't a crime, ma'am," Ramirez said evenly. "Did he approach anyone or act aggressively?" "No, but I know what I saw," Margaret snapped, her frustration mounting. "People like him always pretend to be harmless until they..." Unveiling the past. Malik Weston stood by the door, his hand frozen in midair, as he heard his daughter's voice trembling through the phone. "Dad, he's back," her voice cracked, as if she were on the verge of tears. The words rang in his ears like a curse. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the world outside his apartment, peaceful and mundane, disappeared. He had been busy, so wrapped up in the demands of his job and the countless distractions of life that he hadn't realized how much his daughter had been struggling. Now, hearing the fear in her voice, he felt an unsettling mix of guilt and fear. "Who's back, Zoe?" Malik asked, his voice far too calm, as if his daughter's distress were something he could easily dismiss. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Zoe spoke again, the words stumbling out of her mouth. "Mr. Jacobs, the bus driver." A cold shiver ran down Malik's spine. Mr. Jacobs was the same man who had driven the school bus for years, always friendly, always kind, at least in the eyes of the parents. The man had a reputation for being a good, reliable figure, someone the school trusted. But it was clear from the tone of Zoe's voice that her experience had been something altogether different. Malik had always prided himself on his ability to provide for Zoe and give her a safe environment. His life revolved around her, her well-being, her happiness, her success. To think that the one place he thought she was safe, her school and her daily commute, had been violated, left him speechless. "Zoe," he said slowly, fighting back the wave of panic threatening to rise in his chest. "Tell me what happened. What do you mean by he's back?" She hesitated, but then the words spilled out, each one more horrifying than the last. "It's been happening for a while, Dad. After school, when everyone else gets off the bus, he makes me stay. He says it's because I'm a good student, that he wants to talk to me about how to do better in class. But I don't want to talk to him anymore. He touches me when no one else is looking. His hand, Dad, it always goes too far." The room went silent. Malik's heart pounded in his ears, each beat a roar that drowned out everything else. Zoe's words had been clear, yet hearing them spoken aloud made them impossible to comprehend. The man she had trusted, the one who had been part of her routine for years, was not the figure of safety he had seemed to be. No, he was something far darker. He had to act. Malik knew that he couldn't waste another second. "Zoe, listen to me," he said, his voice sharp but calm, the urgency in his tone cutting through the raw fear in her words. "You're going to stay on the phone with me, okay? Don't hang up. I'm going to the school right now. We're going to get this fixed, and no one is going to hurt you again. Do you understand?" "I understand," Zoe whispered back, her voice still trembling. Malik's pulse was racing. He could hear the tremor in her breath. The same fear he felt, echoing in every word. But he had no time to waste on his emotions. His only thought was getting to her, making sure she was safe. He bolted from his apartment, not even taking a moment to grab his jacket, knowing every second counted. He arrived at the school in what seemed like an eternity. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the building seemed oddly quiet. As he walked through the hallways, his mind raced through every possible scenario. He could already hear Mr. Jacobs' calm, reassuring voice in his mind, the voice that could disarm any suspicion. How had he gotten away with it all these years? How had no one seen through the facade of the mild-mannered driver? The door to the school office was slightly ajar, and Malik entered without knocking. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Weston, is everything all right?" "I need to speak to Principal Reynolds," Malik said, his voice steady but firm. "It's urgent. I need to know where Mr. Jacobs is." The receptionist nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone, and hurriedly called the principal's office. Within moments, Principal Reynolds appeared, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a warm smile that Malik had never fully trusted. There was something about the way the principal smiled too often, as though trying to hide something beneath the surface. "Mr. Weston, what brings you here today?" Principal Reynolds asked, his voice too friendly for the situation. "Don't play games, Reynolds," Malik replied, his voice cold. "I know what's been happening on that bus. My daughter just told me everything. Now I need to know where Mr. Jacobs is, and I need to know why the school hasn't done anything about it." The principal's face shifted from friendly to guarded, a subtle but telling change. "Mr. Weston, I assure you, I have no idea what you're referring to. Mr. Jacobs has been a trusted member of our staff for years. He's never had any complaints against him." Malik clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. "You don't get it. He's been hurting my daughter, and who knows how many others. I want him fired, and I want him arrested." The principal remained silent for a moment, his eyes flickering toward the side of the room, as if debating how to respond. The air between them thickened, the weight of Malik's words hanging like a storm cloud, ready to burst. "I'll call the authorities," Principal Reynolds said, his voice tight. "But there's nothing we can do without evidence, without your daughter's statement." Malik cut him off. "Don't worry about that. I've already got that covered." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, showing the principal the text he had just received. Zoe had texted him a picture of her class schedule and the bus route times, as well as a few screenshots of the messages Mr. Jacobs had sent her. It was enough to begin building a case, but Malik knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to rest until Mr. Jacobs was held accountable, until every parent knew what had been happening under their noses. He wasn't going to let the man's reputation shield him any longer. "Get ready for a fight, Reynolds," Malik said, his voice low and filled with determination. "This is just the start." As he left the principal's office, his mind was already on the next steps. He had to make sure Zoe was safe, but he also had to ensure that the truth came out. Every bit of evidence he could gather, every person who would stand with him, it was all going to matter in the fight ahead. He would not let this man get away with his crimes, no matter what it took. For Zoe, for every child on that bus, he would make sure justice was served. And for the first time in a long time, Malik Weston felt the stirring of something more powerful than fear. It was a force far stronger: determination. Part 2 dives deep into the emotional and psychological toll on Malik and Zoe, focusing not just on the immediate discovery of the abuse, but on the steps they take to fight back. It reflects both the heart-wrenching parental love and the empowerment that comes from taking action in the face of fear and injustice. The unfolding mystery. It had been nearly a week since Detective Harris' initial meeting with Jennifer, and the case, though still a puzzle, had started to slowly take shape. He was no closer to understanding the intricate web of deception woven around the Plumtree family. But one thing was certain: there was more at play than met the eye. Harris spent the better part of his morning reviewing the evidence again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces weren't just disconnected. They were deliberately misleading. The fact that Jennifer's body had been found in the office, a room so rarely used, was strange enough, but what disturbed him further was the absence of any signs of a struggle. Jennifer's makeup was immaculate, and she appeared to have been in the midst of something important when her life was taken. The phone records had already been checked, and there was no indication of any phone calls to or from her husband, Tardy, after the argument on the night of their wedding. Yet, one detail stood out to Harris. Jennifer had received several cryptic messages from an anonymous number in the weeks leading up to her death. No one seemed to know who was sending them. Could these messages have been the key to uncovering the truth? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on his office door. He looked up to see Officer Morgan standing in the doorway, holding a folder in her hands. She had been working the case from a different angle, focusing on the Plumtree family's past and their relationships. "I've been digging into Tardy's background," Morgan said, setting the file on the desk and sliding it toward Harris. "There's something you need to see." Harris flipped the folder open, scanning the contents quickly. The file contained a mix of public records, financial documents, and some photographs that caught his attention. One image, in particular, stood out: a picture of Tardy and Jeeve, taken several months before the wedding, at a local cafe. They were laughing, clearly comfortable with each other, but what caught Harris's eye was the small, subtle gesture in the photo. Tardy was holding Jeeve's hand under the table, a move that could easily be missed if you weren't paying close attention. "I've already spoken to Jeeve," Officer Morgan continued. "She says nothing out of the ordinary was happening between them. But we know that her relationship with Tardy was strained, especially toward the end." Strained. Harris had already learned that Tardy's mother, Cordelia, was fiercely protective of her son, and her presence loomed over every aspect of the couple's lives. It was clear to him that Jennifer had been walking a tightrope, trying to maintain peace with the domineering mother-in-law, while also grappling with the intense pressure of her marriage. But what had gone wrong? And where did Jeeve fit into this tangled web? The more Harris thought about it, the more the story seemed to shift. He was no longer convinced that the motive was simply a crime of passion or jealousy. He was beginning to see the makings of something much darker, a web of manipulation, control, and secrets that had festered for years within the Plumtree family. Determined to dig deeper, Harris turned his attention to Cordelia Gosling. If anyone had the answers to this puzzle, it was her. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when Harris arrived at Cordelia's sprawling estate. The house, perched on the edge of a steep hill, seemed to exude a sense of power and intimidation, much like its owner. As Harris rang the doorbell, he mentally prepared himself for whatever he might find. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing Cordelia in an elegant dress that matched the luxurious surroundings. Her sharp features softened slightly when she saw Harris, though there was no warmth in her expression. "Detective Harris, what a surprise," she said in a cool, almost rehearsed tone. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm here to ask you a few questions about your son and his wife," Harris replied. Cordelia's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, but she didn't invite him in. "I've already given my statement. What more do you need to know?" "I think you know more than you're letting on, Mrs. Gosling," Harris said, his voice steady but firm. "I want to know about Jennifer, about the kind of relationship she had with your son, and what might have been going on behind closed doors." Cordelia remained silent for a long moment, as if weighing whether to reveal anything further. Then she stepped aside and motioned for Harris to enter the house. "Come in, then," she said, "but don't expect any revelations. My son is innocent. His wife had her demons, and they finally caught up with her." The house was eerily quiet, the walls adorned with expensive artwork and family portraits. The scent of polished wood and lavender lingered in the air. But Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the place. Every corner seemed to hide something, secrets, perhaps, or memories that were better left undisturbed. They made their way to the sitting room, where Cordelia gestured for Harris to take a seat. She remained standing, her posture regal and imposing. "Tell me about Tardy and Jennifer's relationship," Harris pressed. "What was it like before the wedding?" Cordelia's lips twisted in a thin, humorless smile. "They were fine. Tardy is a good boy, and Jennifer, well, she was a lovely girl when she wasn't making waves." "Making waves?" Harris asked, raising an eyebrow. "Jennifer always wanted more," Cordelia replied, her voice tinged with disdain. She couldn't accept that she wasn't the center of attention. She wanted everything: the house, the lifestyle, the family. But she wasn't cut out for it. "You think she was responsible for her own death?" Harris asked, leaning forward. Cordelia's eyes flashed with something dangerous, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. "I think she pushed my son too far. And in the end, she couldn't handle the life she chose. Not every story ends happily, Detective." Harris didn't buy her story, but he also knew he wasn't going to get any more information from her today. She was hiding something, and he was determined to uncover it. As he stood to leave, Cordelia added, "If you're looking for answers, you won't find them here." "I beg to differ," Harris said, his tone clipped. "I'll be back, Mrs. Gosling, and when I return, I'm going to uncover everything." With that, he left the house, his mind racing with more questions than answers. The case was spiraling deeper into a labyrinth of deceit, and he was just getting started. Later that evening, as Harris sat in his office reviewing the case files, he received an unexpected call. It was Officer Morgan. "Detective, we've got something," she said. "We've traced those anonymous messages Jennifer received. And guess what? They weren't from some stranger. They were from someone very close to her." Harris's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he demanded. "Jeeve Plumtree," Morgan replied. The messages came from her phone. That revelation sent a chill down Harris's spine. Was Jeeve truly the innocent bystander she had portrayed herself as? Or was there something darker lurking beneath her gentle exterior? The fall. The storm had arrived with the force of a freight train, but Malik Weston stood still in the parking lot, his eyes tracing the ripples of rain that splashed against the concrete. The storm, relentless as it was, mirrored the chaos in his heart. The weight of the conversation he had just had with Mrs. Shaw, his daughter's teacher, still hung over him like an unwelcome fog. Every word had cut deeper than the last, but he didn't know yet how deep the wound had really gone. The call had been placed -911 on the other end of the line, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. He had told them everything. The hints, the actions, and the disturbing manner in which Mrs. Shaw had dismissed him when he demanded an explanation. But what about the unspeakable truth he suspected? What about the horrifying possibility that his daughter had been the target of more than just neglect? After hanging up, Malik walked slowly back to his truck, the rain making his steps heavier, slower, as if the storm were trying to weigh him down further. He slammed the door shut, but even as the truck's interior provided a small sense of refuge, his mind continued to race. His thoughts drifted to his daughter, Aliyah, the young girl who had brought so much joy into his life, whose laughter could light up any room, and whose heart was full of warmth that even the coldest of people couldn't help but feel. She had been so excited when she got into the prestigious private school, a place Malik had fought for her to attend, believing that it would be her chance at a better future. He had dreamed of this day for years, of seeing her grow up, strong, confident, and unburdened by the struggles of his own past. But now, as he sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something precious, something sacred, was slipping away from him. He thought of the subtle but persistent changes in Aliyah, the way she had become more withdrawn, less eager to speak about her day, her once bright eyes now clouded with something darker. What had happened in that school? What had been done to his little girl? The sounds of sirens grew closer, cutting through the thick rain like a knife. The blaring red and blue lights reflected in the side mirrors of his truck, and the weight in Malik's chest deepened. He had called them, but now he couldn't be sure that anyone would take him seriously. No one had really listened when he tried to confront the school before. Had they really done anything to protect Aliyah? The officers who approached the truck were young, barely in their 20s, their faces hidden behind the hoods of their raincoats. They looked at Malik as they walked by, their eyes darting briefly toward him before quickly focusing on the front doors of the school. One of them, a tall officer with dark hair and a rigid posture, knocked on the door before speaking to Mrs. Shaw, who had now come outside. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," the officer said to Malik, his voice calm but firm. "We've got to get a statement from you." Malik nodded, his gut tightening. "What about my daughter?" he asked. "Where is she? What's happening to her?" "She's safe for now, sir. We'll update you in a moment, but we need to gather more information." Malik knew this wasn't enough. The helplessness, the uncertainty of what was truly happening inside that building gnawed at him. They weren't ready to face the truth yet, but Malik was, and he would do whatever it took to uncover it. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue or explore any particular aspects further." Unraveling the truth. By the time Malik Weston found his seat at the back of the classroom, his mind was swirling with questions that had no immediate answers. The heavy weight of everything his daughter had just confessed was pressing against him, threatening to break his resolve. What kind of a person would do something like that to a child? He had spent his life protecting those he loved, yet here was a person who had abused the very trust he held sacred. Worse, he had no idea who the perpetrator was. Was it the teacher? Was it someone else in the school? But for now, Malik focused on his daughter. She was shaking, her eyes wide with fear, glancing toward the door every few moments, as though waiting for someone to burst in and pull her away. But what had happened wasn't something that could be taken back, and her pain wasn't something he could ignore. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Most of the children rushed out of the room, their laughter echoing in the hallway, but Amara remained frozen in her seat. Malik's gaze softened as he met her eyes, nodding to her. "We're going to handle this, I promise you." He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath until he heard his own voice, steady, despite the chaos of emotions boiling within him. Malik took Amara's hand, and the two of them walked out of the classroom together. The halls of the school felt more suffocating now, as though they were closing in on him. He was no longer in a place of safety, but one that had failed his daughter in ways he couldn't fathom. And as they reached the parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking through the suffocating silence. It was a message from his wife, Alicia. He hesitated before reading it, dreading what new complication had emerged in their already twisted situation. "We need to talk. I've been doing some thinking." A brief pang of guilt shot through him. Was there more to this than he had realized? Was Alicia somehow involved? Was this why Amara had been so withdrawn lately? Malik shook his head to clear his mind. Now wasn't the time for doubts about his wife. He would deal with that later. Right now, there was a more pressing issue. They drove home in silence. The usual conversation that happened during their car rides, the silly jokes, the questions about school, was absent. It was as if a cloud had settled over them, one that neither of them knew how to shake off. Once home, Malik ushered Amara inside and to her room, where she flopped down on the bed. He paused, watching her for a long moment, wondering if she was okay. It wasn't just the abuse that had crushed her. It was the sense of violation, the realization that she hadn't been protected, not even in the one place she was supposed to feel safe. He could feel his heart break every time he looked at her. Malik pulled out his phone, preparing to make the call he had been avoiding all day. He could feel the tightness in his chest as he dialed the number. He didn't want to make this call, not yet, but he couldn't delay it any longer. The phone rang, once, twice, and then someone answered. 911. What's your emergency? I'm Malik Weston, he said, his voice tight but resolute. I need to report a crime. My daughter's been. He stopped. He couldn't even say the words. They felt foreign, impossible, hanging in the air, suffocating. His mind scrambled for a way to convey what had happened, but how do you explain something so dark, so monstrous? Sir, please calm down. If this is an emergency, I need you to stay calm and tell me exactly what happened. Malik took a deep breath. He had to do this. For Amara. He had to make sure she would be safe. My daughter's been abused at school. I don't know by whom, but she's been telling me things. Things I wish she never had to say. I need someone to help me investigate this. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, a sound that could have been the operator typing or just their breath. But Malik didn't care. All he could focus on was his daughter, the pain in her voice, the fear in her eyes. Sir, we will send someone out immediately. Can you please tell me if she is injured? Do you need medical attention? Malik rubbed his face, wiping away a tear he hadn't realized had fallen. He wasn't crying. No, he was angry, furious even. He didn't have time for tears. But still, the emotion slipped through. No, she's not physically hurt, not like that. But I can't imagine the kind of harm this has done to her. We'll send someone right away, the operator said, soothing his panic, but it didn't quell his anger. He disconnected the call, unable to shake the feeling that he was still missing something, that there was some part of this that wasn't fully clear. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop until he knew everything. In the meantime, he needed to talk to Alicia. His wife needed to understand what had happened and how he planned to handle it. But he couldn't do that until he knew what had really been going on with Amara's school. He needed to protect her, his daughter, first. It wasn't until he was standing outside Amara's room, looking through the crack in the door, that he heard her soft sobs, a sound that twisted his insides like a knife. Her tears didn't just break his heart, they fueled his resolve. Hours passed before the police arrived, a uniformed officer knocking on the door with a look of quiet professionalism. He introduced himself as Officer Carter, a man in his early 30s with a kind but firm demeanor. He didn't waste any time getting down to business, sitting across from Malik at the kitchen table, his notebook ready. I've heard the situation, sir, and we're going to investigate thoroughly, Officer Carter said, his voice serious but empathetic. But in order to do that, I'll need your daughter's full statement. I'm sure you understand that. Malik's jaw clenched. He had feared this moment, the moment his daughter would have to relive the horror. He wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of pain. But he also knew there was no other choice. I'll have her ready, he said, rising from the table. She'll talk to you, I promise. As he turned to walk toward Amara's room, a question lingered in the air. One he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. Who would do something so terrible to a child? And why? But that question could only be answered once the truth came to light. Malik only hoped it was soon, before the darkness that hung over them consumed them all. The final choice. As the last days of summer stretched out, Alexis's world felt as though it had been rewritten. The truth about her mother's relationship with Mr. Webb weighed heavily on her heart, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside of her. Every glance she shared with her mother now felt strained, as if they were both carrying a weight they could no longer ignore. And even though they never spoke directly about it, Alexis knew things had shifted. The calls had stopped. The late-night conversations had ceased. Mr. Webb was no longer around, no longer pulling her mother's strings. She wasn't sure if he had left voluntarily, or if it had been something more dramatic. But the relief was palpable. For the first time in a long while, Alexis could breathe freely again. But the sense of freedom wasn't the only thing Alexis had discovered over the past few months. She had uncovered something deeper, something more unsettling: her own strength. As the days dragged into weeks, Alexis found herself replaying every conversation with her mother, every moment she had shared with Mr. Webb. It was like trying to untangle a web of lies, half-truths, and pain. But in the end, one thing was clear: her mother had made a choice. She had chosen Alexis over everything else. That realization, though bittersweet, gave Alexis a new sense of resolve. There was no going back to how things were before. No returning to that quiet, complacent girl who had allowed herself to be overlooked and ignored. Alexis understood now that life was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes terribly painful, but she also understood that she had the power to choose her own path. It was a few weeks after the incident that Alexis's mother, Margaret, finally asked her to sit down. She had been quiet in the days that followed, and though she tried to act normal, there was something in her eyes, something Alexis couldn't quite place. Margaret had been distant, but now she seemed to have made up her mind about something. "I know this has been hard on you, Alexis," she began, her voice quiet and measured. "I don't know how to fix it. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. But I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know who I was anymore. I lost myself for a while, but I'm trying to find my way back." Alexis sat silently across from her mother, her hands clasped in her lap. She had spent so much time feeling angry, hurt, and betrayed, but now, as her mother spoke, she felt a softening inside. She couldn't completely forgive her mother yet, not when the scars were still fresh, but she realized that forgiveness was something she had to give herself first, before she could give it to anyone else. "I don't know if I can just forgive you right now," Alexis said slowly, "but I think I can try to move forward. Not for you, not for anyone else, but for me." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for that." The next day, Alexis decided to visit Mr. Webb's old house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked up the worn steps, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders with every step she took away from the past. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find. Maybe some sort of closure, maybe the final confirmation that he was no longer a part of their lives. But as she stood at the door, ready to knock, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of what he represented. When the door opened, it wasn't Mr. Webb who greeted her. It was someone she didn't expect, his wife. "I don't think we've met," Mrs. Webb said, her voice low and measured, but there was an undercurrent of recognition in her eyes. "What can I help you with?" Alexis hesitated. She had no idea what she was going to say. It wasn't like she was there to demand answers or seek some kind of revenge. She had just wanted to put an end to all of this. The secrecy, the lies, the broken promises. "I'm Alexis," she said, her voice steady but unsure. "I'm here because I needed to know if everything was okay. If you're okay. If my mother's okay." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I just needed closure. For myself." Mrs. Webb looked at her for a long moment, as though contemplating how much she should reveal. Then, to Alexis's surprise, she stepped aside, and motioned for her to come in. The house was quiet, eerily so, and the air felt thick with tension. But Mrs. Webb didn't waste any time. "I know why you're here," she said quietly, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've known about my husband's involvement with your mother. I found out some time ago, but I didn't know how to handle it. I wanted to pretend everything was fine, that the lies didn't matter. But they do matter, don't they?" Alexis nodded, surprised by Mrs. Webb's admission. She had expected anger, hostility, or at least some form of defense. But instead, Mrs. Webb seemed to be genuinely remorseful. "I've seen what my husband's actions have done to your family. I've seen how it's torn you apart. And I can't undo the damage," Mrs. Webb continued. "But I can tell you this. It's over. He's gone, and it's time for both of us to heal. If that's even possible." Alexis felt a lump form in her throat, but she managed to choke out the words, "Thank you for saying that." As Alexis walked away from Mr. Webb's house, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew that the past no longer had any power over her. The choices she made moving forward would be her own. In the days that followed, Alexis continued to rebuild her life with her mother. They spent more time together than they had in years, and though the road ahead was uncertain, Alexis felt a newfound sense of connection between them. But the real change had come from within. She realized that no one could define her. No man, no relationship, no event in her past. It was her choices, her actions, her heart, that determined who she was and who she would become. The scars would always be there, but they were hers, and they didn't control her. Not anymore. The chapter had closed, and a new one was beginning. And Alexis Weston was ready to face it, whatever it brought.